Hello, ladies and gentlemen. You're very welcome to our oilseed rape webinar titled Crop Nutrition, the Role It Plays in Oilseed Rape Establishment. My name is Eva Ross, Marketing and PR Manager for Yara UK and Ireland, and I'm delighted to be joined by our guest presenter, Sarah Kendall, Principal Research Scientist for Crop Physiology at ADAS, and Natalie Wood Yara's arable agronomist for UK and Ireland. Sarah, many thanks for taking the time to join Natalie and I today. Sarah will take us through basic principles for oilseed rape establishment, pros and cons to early and late drilling, and insights from oilseed yen. And Natalie will then take us through seed treatments, autumn nutrition, and micronutrients in autumn. So Sarah, the floor is yours to start us there.
Okay, thanks a lot, Eva, and hi everyone. As Eva said, my name's Sarah Kendall. I work as a crop physiologist at ADAS, and it's really great to be here talking about looking forward really to establishing oilseed rape this season. So I thought I'd start by just setting the scene a little bit with where are we with oilseed rape. We know that cabbage stem flea beetle and the weather has posed significant challenges to growing oilseed rape over the last few years. But if we think back over the last 12 months or so, the establishment in 2020 was generally better than what we'd seen in previous seasons. And really, I think one of the main contributions to that was the fact that there was adequate soil moisture. If we think about the weather conditions over the 2020-21 season, we've actually seen a number of different kind of weather conditions that have been positive for yield. So the warm March, the dry sunny April, and also the wet cool May have been positive for yield. That's not forgetting the fact that conditions in December were actually very wet in some areas, and also in April we saw in some areas those frequent frosts that may have posed an issue for some crops. In general, cabbage stem flea beetle larval pressure was low to moderate, although there were some reports of high levels of infestation in some crops. We shouldn't forget that currently oilseed rape prices are also high. So looking forward, what does this mean for establishment of oilseed rape over the next 12 months? Well, I think there may be growers who have, moved away from growing rape over the last couple of years that may be having another go this season. So it will be interesting to see whether we see an increase in the area of oilseed rape being grown. But I think what's really fundamental here is that we need to be remembering best practice for the establishment of oilseed rape and the management that comes with that there onwards. So I'm going to cover some best practice elements for establishing oilseed rape, and this will be intermingled a bit with what we're learning about managing cabbage stem flea beetle too. I'll then highlight our thinking in terms of an IPM strategy for flea beetle, and this has been kind of formed as part of an AHDB industry funded project. And then at the end I'm going to touch on oilseed yen as well. So to start, I think just really highlighting how fundamental soil moisture is to successfully establishing oilseed rape is really important. So the picture shown on this slide really illustrates this very nicely. So this is a picture of a crop of oilseed rape at ADAS Rosemond in Herefordshire. In the preceding season, it had been the site of a rotational experiment, and the area in the centre of this photo was a first wheat, and the areas either side were lower yielding second and subsequent wheats. And where the second wheats were grown, there was lower water offtake, and that meant that there was sufficient moisture remaining in the soil for the following oilseed rape crop to establish. But what you can see in the centre of this photo is where the first wheat was, there was a lack of water, and this has resulted in almost crop failure. So a key message is if the conditions are dry, then it's better to delay until moisture is present. And there is technology emerging now for estimating soil moisture from satellite and weather data as well. So we've talked about oilseed rape being sensitive to soil moisture. I mean, this isn't the whole story, because moisture availability to the seed is also affected by soil aggregate size and also that seed to soil contact too. So this graph here shows the relationship between the days after sowing and the percent emergence for a range of different soil aggregate sizes. And the target really should be an aggregate size of around 15 millimeters or less to try and maximize that seed to soil contact. And you can see here that where the soil aggregate size was more than 23 millimeters, this had a really drastic effect on the percent emergence. So it's important to roll to maximize that seed to soil contact, and also you could consider double rolling as well. Another aspect when establishing rape is ensuring that the drilling depth is to the right depth and that is consistent. So the graph shown on this slide shows the relationship between the sowing depth, and this was on a sandy soil site, and emergence. And what you can see is when the depth gets deeper than 4 centimeters, that emergence really does start to drop off. So we're targeting a sowing depth of ideally between 2 to 3 centimeters. I'm going to move on now to talking about drilling date, which I think is a really important aspect when we're thinking about establishing rape for this coming season. I'm going to start by talking about the impact of drilling date on yield, and then I'll come to the effects that drilling date can have on cabbage stem flea beetle damage. So in this graph here, the data shown is from oilseed rape sow date trials carried out that has been reported in the scientific literature, and the majority of these were from small plot experiments. But a key message here is actually there is a lot of flexibility in terms of drilling date and the impact that this has on yield. And I think an important message is that actually by drilling later, this doesn't always lead to a big yield penalty. And what you can see in this graph is that some of these crops were actually drilled into October, and the yields in some cases did stay fairly stable. So I think it's to consider late drilling as a possibility really, and not just go with the assumption that that would definitely reduce yield. But obviously, you need to consider your soil types and your own situations as to whether late drilling may be suitable or not. So we've talked about the impact on yield, but another really important aspect of this is thinking about how drilling date may affect the cabbage stem flea beetle pressure that the crop experiences. So the data that's shown in this graph here is actually from some work that we did at AGAS with my colleagues in the entomology group in a previous AHDB funded project. And this was using a mixture of survey data and also some historic survey data sets, where we were trying to identify the impact of drilling date on both adult damage and also the larval pressure. And we carried out a number of modelling exercises with this data. And what we were able to show is that as the crop stage at cabbage stem flea beetle migration got greater, so as the crop was more developed at that peak migration point, the percent of leaf area lost reduced. So you can see in this graph here that if the crop is only just emerging at peak migration, a significant proportion of leaf area can be lost. And if the crop is starting to beyond that, that phase where it is really susceptible to damage, you can see that the leaf area lost is reduced. So we're looking to establish robust crops, and ideally we want to avoid pest damage. So we're also interested to look at the impact of drilling day on the larval pressure. And so what we were able to show again through a modelling exercise was that where crops had been drilled into September, these crops had fewer larvae per plant. So it's showing that drilling day can be used as a tool to have an effect on the pressure that the crop experiences. Seed rates are obviously another really important aspect in terms of establishing oilseed rape. And this example in the slide here shows data from an experiment carried out in East Yorkshire. And this crop was actually sown late, so sown at mid-September. And we had 5 different seed rates in this experiment. And we measured yield, and we were able to determine what the economic optimum seed rate was. And actually in this experiment, it was only 26 seeds per metre square. So this is just highlighting that there is potential, even in a later drilling situation, that optimum seed rates are not that high. And I think this is something to consider carefully. In this slide, I'm summarising a number of experiments that were done actually 10 years or more ago now, where we were able to estimate what the optimum plant population was. And what we found was that this was generally between 20 and 25 plants per metre square. But there is one caveat there, and obviously this is challenging because we can't predict the weather, but what we have seen is that where conditions in the spring are very dry, as you can see here at the Norfolk and the Yorkshire site in 2011, there's a restriction in terms of compensatory branching, and this then means that a higher plant population is required for optimal yield. We also need to be mindful of interactions between seed rate and cabbage stem flea beetle, and does this mean that we should be thinking about seed rates differently? So again, this is data from experiments that were carried out in the previous AHDB funded project that ADAS led. And what we saw really were inconsistent benefits of increasing seed rate on adult damage. So there wasn't a clear indication that by increasing the seed rate, there would be a reduced amount of leaf area lost. So we saw a similar proportion of plants lost to flea beetle across multiple seed rates. But what's really important is that we didn't actually see a reduction in the larval pressure. So when we looked at the number of larvae per plant, there wasn't a dilution effect in terms of the number of larvae per plant with higher seed rates. There may be cases where small increases in seed rate may help in high cabbage stem flea beetle pressure situations, or where there may be poor establishment conditions. But I think one thing to recognise is that given there's no reduction in the number of larvae per plant, and if there are more plants with a higher seed rate, actually there's a higher pest return. And you can see that shown in the graph here, whereby with increasing seed rate, the number of larvae per metre square increases. I think another important aspect is nutrition, and obviously Natalie will come on to cover this in much more detail. But in terms of thinking about autumn soil and supply and whether or not the crop needs nitrogen application at drilling. So we did some work where we were able to show that typically an autumn sown crop will have 87 kilos of N per hectare nitrogen in the soil. But if it's a no-till situation, this number reduces by between 5 and 25 kilos of N per hectare due to the reduced mineralisation from less soil disturbance. For an oilseed rape crop to achieve a green area index of around 1, it would require an autumn N uptake of 50 kilos of N per hectare. And so what we were able to show here is that up to 50% of fields would need additional nitrogen at drilling to achieve that green area index of 1 by going into the winter. So I just want to spend a couple of moments now just talking about IPM and cabbage stem flea beetle and how things are fitting together. So we're leading a new AHDB and industry funded project looking at reducing the impact of cabbage stem flea beetle, and Yara are a partner in this project. The aim is really to minimise the impact of cabbage stem flea beetle, and this is through an improved understanding of the pest phenology and biology, and also through testing and the validation of on-farm control approaches. So I've talked about the impact of drilling date on cabbage stem flea beetle damage and what's experienced by the crop. But in terms of our thinking about IPM and cabbage stem flea beetle, we really see additional strategies for managing flea beetle being implemented into an overall strategy based on the type of pressure expected from drilling date. And so in this table, it breaks down the drilling windows into 4 different dates and kind of indicates where the focus should be in terms of thinking about managing different cabbage stem flea beetle pressure. So whether it's the larvae from early drilling or whether later into mid-September and late September, the focus should still be on reducing adult damage. And in that situation, it's unlikely that there will be significant larval damage. So this table, I'm not going to talk through it in lots of detail, but it just summarises really where we see other factors or other mitigation techniques fitting into the context of when the crop was drilled. And obviously some of these, fit in across multiple drilling date windows, and other factors may be more specific. But I think the key here is thinking about the strategy and what the aim of those different components is to achieve, and whether you need that. So if you're drilling early, it's unlikely that the crop is going to suffer from significant adult damage, but the larvae are going to be more of an issue. So it's marrying up those strategies based on that. And if you want more information of this, there is my colleague Sasha White's written a bit of a blog, and that's available on the AHDB website. I'm just going to finish up now by highlighting a few things that have come out of Oilseed Yen. So we set Oilseed Yen up in 2016, and you can see the sponsors of Oilseed Yen on this slide, and we're really grateful to all of the sponsors, including Yara, for their continued support. The aim of Oilseed Yen has been trying to understand and identify how we can improve the yields of oilseed rape in the UK. And clearly, flea beetle poses a big challenge in doing that, but we still have big aspirations. We know that the UK yield potential is 2 to 3 times the national average oilseed rape yield. So there is lots of scope for increasing yield. It is a challenge. We've had challenging weather and we've got flea beetle, and those are things that obviously we have to try and deal with. We know oilseed rape is sink limited, so trying to maximise the number of seeds per metre square that are set by the plant is really important. That is the most important yield component. And really this comes with optimising canopy size at flowering. And so that really goes back to that message around thinking about seed rates and plant populations very carefully, managing the nutrition carefully, and making sure that you manage the actual canopy that you've got. So if you've drilled early, you're likely to have a forward big canopy, and that needs managing differently to a late drilled crop. There should also be focus on maximising seed filling, so looking at trying to prolong canopy life and especially keeping those leaves green through managing nutrition correctly and also thinking about foliar disease as well. And importantly, also thinking about maximising soil water storage as well. And I think this comes back to thinking about soils and thinking about soils that are not likely to be waterlogged over winter and then drought over summer. And I just wanted to quickly highlight that within oilseed yen, we've now included a focus on establishment. So we want to make sure that it remains relevant to growers across the UK. So we've introduced an establishment beauty contest, and this has drilling date categories. And we've also increased the information that is captured around the establishment period. So we want to improve our knowledge and our understanding of how we establish oilseed rape successfully. And really that's a kind of joint effort working with growers and agronomists. So just to finish really and summarise, so we know that the weather can have a huge effect on the outcome of growing oilseed rape. So I think considering field choice carefully is important, and thinking about, you know, soil types and the weather and the impact that that has. So use drilling date as a tool to try and manage cabbage stem flea beetle pressure. Ensure that there's adequate moisture at drilling and delay if necessary. I think we need to move away from saying we're going to drill rape on this particular day or this weekend and then there not being moisture and then it failing. So really focusing in on that moisture is important. Consider seed rate carefully. So what are the negative effects if it is too high? Make sure that there is an adequate nitrogen supply to try and achieve that green area index of around 1. And then fit further management strategies around the likely cabbage stem flea beetle pressure, and that being on the basis of drilling date. And I'll finish there. Thank you very much. And I'm now going to hand over to Natalie.
Thanks, Sarah. Let me just show my screen. So you can see that. So yeah, thanks. There's some really useful insights there from ADAS and what you've gained from that yield enhancement network. So some really good information. Thanks for that. So as Eva mentioned earlier, I'm going to cover the following topics, which are how seed treatments can help aid establishment, which fertilizer to choose, whether placement is an option or not, and we've got some data on that, and which nutrients are really key at this timing. And then finally, how micronutrients can also help that crop going into the winter. So if we start with nutritional seed treatments, then you can see here we've got Glytrel MNP, which is one of our seed treatments. And the idea of a nutritional seed treatment is to increase that speed of establishment. Coating the seed obviously ensures that the nutrients are in the treatment, the nutrients that are in the treatment are concentrated at the source. So meaning as soon as that seed germinates, it's able to take up water and the nutrients are also being taken up as well. The mixture of nutrients is also important. So this product here, Glytrel MNP, contains equal amounts of both phosphorus and manganese, and these two nutrients are particularly important at this very early stage of growth. Phosphorus is important for roots and shoots, protein synthesis, and also energy transfer, and all of these things are vitally important at these first early growth stages. Within the soil, we know that phosphate is very mobile. It can travel less than 1 millimeter within the soil, which means it's very limited, especially to a freshly germinated seed, from being able to access it easily. So of course, with the phosphate in the seed treatment, it's there at that point of growth, and therefore it isn't likely to become a limiting factor to that very early development. Manganese is also important for a variety of systems within the plant, such as chlorophyll production, electron transfer in photosynthesis, and again, both important for cotyledon stage. And manganese also plays a role in enzyme activation and therefore carbohydrate metabolism. So yeah, which will impact upon the efficiency of photosynthesis, which again is important at this key stage. And if it is deficient, if manganese is deficient, then it's going to start to impact upon that efficiency, which again, we don't want to have any limiting factors for these young seedlings. So in terms of a rate of this product, then you're looking at about 5 litres per tonne. And I appreciate that it might be too late now for some of you, but if you do have the ability to dress seed on farm, then Glytrel MMP is certainly worth considering. We've got some trials data as well. This was a trial that we did in 2019, and you can see the difference there between the untreated and the treated in terms of the speed of establishment, but also the growth stage difference between that treated plot and the untreated plot. This is a trial from last season, so we're still to yield this trial, but this is some early data. This was drilled on the 5th of August, and then these measurements were taken 33 days later. And if we look at the treatments, then we have a control, which is obviously untreated, Glytrel MMP alone, and then Glytrel MMP followed by Activa S, which has either been placed or broadcast. And we can see from all the treated plots, there is an increase in both the root and shoot weights. But from the seed treatment alone, you can see there's a 20% increase in both of those approximately. As you'd expect, the addition of the NPKS grade has given a further increase in the weights as well, in both the placed and the broadcast. But yeah, these measurements were taken about 2 weeks after emergence, so we're still talking about very early growth here. Now, some other interesting results that we got from this trial were the differences in the number of cabbage stem flea beetle larvae. And this trial is actually part of the consortium that Sarah mentioned earlier, looking at establishment and cabbage stem flea beetle. So if we look at this graph, then you can see there are slight differences there between the treated plots and the untreated. The pressure wasn't high at this site, either unfortunately or fortunately, but you can see there is a decrease in the number of larvae present in the plants that were assessed, and this is in March of the following year. And you can see the biggest decrease of larval numbers comes from the combination of the seed treatment placed with Activa S. However, I wouldn't read too much into this because, of course, this is just one site and one season. Therefore, we will want to repeat this trial to see whether we get similar results in the coming seasons. But just an interesting bit of information, really, to come out of that trial. So if we move on to autumn fertilizer, I've already mentioned Activa S. But of course, what we're interested in is improving the establishment to get the crop up, growing away as quickly as possible. Excuse me. So fertilizer needs to be either placed or applied as soon as possible after drilling to give the crop the best chance to establish. It may very well be tempting to wait to see if you've got a decent crop before applying the fertilizer, but this could often lead to kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, really. If you haven't set the crop up with the best intentions to start with, then you're often setting it up to fail. So really key to get that fertilizer on as soon as possible. As I mentioned, this is Activa S, which is an NPKS grade. You can see the analysis there. And NPK products are really ideal for this timing because we know that the phosphate is required for root and shoot development, as we mentioned earlier, and potassium also helps with root growth and also water regulation, which could be very important if we've got a dry autumn. If we're thinking of rates, then obviously that depends on whether you are placing or broadcasting, but we're looking about 20 to 30 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. And remember that we've got that N-max limit in the autumn for oilseed, which is 30 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare anyway. And it has to be applied before the end of October. So if we think about placement, if you're wondering whether you should consider placing fertilizer, then there's some trials work here looking at 2 different seasons where we had broadcast versus placed. and you can see that at the 25 kilograms of nitrogen rate, which is kind of the most relevant for what we want to put on, then placing the fertilizer has increased the yield by 0.21 tons per hectare, which might not sound like much, but if we look at current kind of delivered prices, then that's about £90 per hectare there. So by placing the fertilizer, obviously you're putting it closer to the seed, and therefore it's easily accessed as it grows, and you've increased the efficiency there. Also, you're wasting less that would potentially be falling between the rows, and this is particularly important for phosphate, which I mentioned doesn't travel well in the soil, as well as for environmental considerations from any potential losses that could happen. So this means when you're placing, obviously you can reduce the rate required to say 20 to 25 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare rather than that NMAX limit of 30. Phosphate and potassium, as I mentioned, are almost equally important here. This is a trial looking at where an NS product was compared to an NPKS product, and we've got 9 different sites here. We can see that all the sites showed an increase in uptake where the NPKS was applied, and therefore it's the addition of that P and K that gave a greater nitrogen uptake efficiency. And if we look at the average at the end, then you can see there's a 20% increase in the N uptake across those 9 sites. However, if you look at trial 2, you can see that that one's had a massive increase there of 40% in uptake. So it does very much depend on each field's situation. With that increased nitrogen uptake, there is obviously increased nitrogen use efficiency too, as the crop is able to utilize that additional nitrogen to produce that biomass during this important phase before winter. This table here, it's got quite a lot of information on it, but basically it's comparing the differences between drill timings and whether the fertilizer was placed or not. You can see that the crops with the place fertilizer have taken up more nitrogen through that increased uptake efficiency, which has then been reflected in the fresh matter values, and also shows a reduction in the recommendation given based on that biomass present, which you can see there in the column at the end. Trials work has shown that using an NPKS in the autumn can help with overwinter survival rates too. And you can see here of rates up to 90 to 100% when we compare it to the NS grade, which is on average 38%. And we've got work to show as well that potassium acts as an antifreeze in the winter by lowering the cell's sap freezing point and preventing frost damage, which kind of explains some of the increased overwinter survival that we've got here. And yeah, if we're looking at a solid system, then that Activa S is a good choice. If we're on liquids, then we've got a good starter fertilizer, which is 1827 plus boron. And that's particularly useful with that addition of boron. So I move on to my final topic, which is autumn micronutrients. I'm sure everyone will have heard of Brassetrol Pro. And what we're trying to do with autumn micronutrients really is make sure that we're not limiting the crop as it moves through those growth stages pre-winter. And this is a great product here, Brassetrol Pro. It's a crop-specific mixture of the key micronutrients that you require for oilseed, and you can see them at the bottom there, but they are magnesium, calcium, boron, manganese, and molybdenum. So they're covering all the key important micronutrients for this crop. In terms of an application rate, then we're looking at 2 to 3 litres in the autumn with a view to following that up in the spring with another application. We know that oilseed can put a lot of biomass on pre-winter, therefore it does have the potential to get those deficiencies because it's taking up a lot of nutrition over such a short space of time to put on that biomass, and with that rapid growth often comes that risk of deficiencies. So you could tissue test, but an easy option is to just use a crop-specific micronutrient product, such as the Brassetrol Pro that we've got here. This is going to help safeguard against any early deficiencies in the spring as well, when you might not have chance to get back in with a spring micronutrient application yet, so talking very early on in the spring. And we've got some data here, long-term data now from 2016 to 2020, and you can see that there's an average yield increase of 0.31 tonnes per hectare from that application at the 2 to 4 leaf stage in the autumn, followed by another one in the spring at onset of stem extension. So in terms of economics, then the 3 litre per hectare, which gives you that 0.33 tonnes per hectare increase, gives you the better return. And again, at current delivered prices, then this is looking at about £143. So definitely worth an application with a good return on investment there. And I've just added this picture here of, this picture here, which shows deficiency, and this is actually boron deficiency. And if boron has been allowed to reach low levels within the plant, you might not necessarily know about it early on, but once it gets to flowering, you might start to see these aborted flowers, which of course means that that's not going to have any pods either. It is too late, obviously, by the time you've got there, so definitely worth keeping an eye on that in terms of tissue tests, or straight bore track or Brastrol Pro, as we've mentioned there. But basically we need to catch that before it's an issue. So in terms of a summary, then seed treatments, particularly phosphate and manganese, are vital at these early growth stages, and it's around the seed, so we've got that nutrition there as soon as the crop requires it. Fertilizer as soon as possible at or after drilling. Placing does give that benefit, but just autumn fertilizer is the key. We want to get something on in the autumn. And from that work, we show that NPKS is better than just NS alone. And then it's about maintaining that crop momentum as we go up into the winter months. Crop-specific micronutrients, it makes life very easy. Everything's in the same can. We're stopping those potential deficiencies occurring during that rapid growth phase and keeping that momentum going into the winter.
So many thanks, and yes, we hope to be back soon. Take care.